In 1966, far from Ghana's shores, two Ghanaians, Elizabeth Puramine and Timothy Adjetey, exchanged vows in England and began building a life as the Adjeteys. They had no children. It was just the quiet rhythm of two people living far from home. Years later, back in Accra, Elizabeth filed for divorce at the High Court. Then she vanished from the process entirely. Her lawyers also vanished too. Week after week, the court called the case and she was absent. Eventually, the judge had no choice but to dismiss her petition. But Timothy was already in the courtroom, armed with his own story, and his narrative cut very deep. He told the court that they had shared a rented apartment in Kanda, while he made efforts at constructing their own house in Teshi. When the house was fairly ready, they packed their belongings into their respective cars and drove off as a couple. Timothy arrived, but Elizabeth never did. One day turned to weeks, and then 2 full months passed, and there was no sign of Elizabeth. It was her own uncle who eventually tracked her down and brought her back. At her second coming, she stayed only briefly before disappearing yet again. Timothy and his father-in-law desperately searched but came up short until a quiet tip pointed to Kanda, the very neighborhood that they had left behind. Elizabeth was living with a man named T.D. Bafu. Tim didn't go alone. He arrived at the premises early in the morning with a policeman. When they entered, they found her. She stood there wrapped only in a cloth, calmly preparing breakfast for another man, and scampering happily around the compound was Timothy's dog, missing since the day his wife disappeared. When confronted, Elizabeth showed no remorse. She instead hurled insults at her husband and the officer, and then refused to leave. The pieces fell into place for Timothy. He had seen her with Mr. Bafu before, but had told himself that it meant nothing. It turned out that love had simply blinded him. Yet another man's name surfaced, David Labby. Labby's wife had confronted him about Elizabeth and got a confession, which she promptly relayed to Tim. But in court, such second-hand stories are deemed to be hearsay, and same was dismissed. The evidence regarding Elizabeth's conduct with Bafu was, however, undeniable. A barely dressed wife cooking breakfast for another man early in the morning, wearing nothing but a cloth. There was enough proof for the court to infer that adultery had been proven. Desertion was even clearer. The marriage was irretrievably broken. The judge granted Timothy the divorce. Tim sought damages from Elizabeth and from Bafu, who was named as a co-respondent. Against Elizabeth, the court took the view that as she had no children and was losing a mouth to feed, he rather stood to gain. But Bafu, however, wasn't so lucky. The judge ordered him to pay 1,000 cedis in costs and damages to soothe Tim's wounded feelings. What do we learn from this case? First, if you file a case and decide to abandon it, your case may be dismissed. Second, proving adultery rarely means catching somebody red-handed. The courts may draw the obvious inference from your actions. And finally, if you interfere knowingly in someone's marriage and you are caught, you may be held financially liable. Follow Super Law GH Studios for more. Real stories, real cases, real people.